This year has shown just how unprepared the world was for a large-scale disaster, and the United States is no exception. In fact, while countries across Europe begin to reopen, even allowing travel within some zones, the U.S. is battling a severe second wave of the pandemic as it continues to devastate the economy. However, the health crisis has not affected all parts of the country equally, and some have been feeling the strain of the times much more than others. For rural zones, civil unrest is seen only on TV screens, and the images of overflowing hospitals and rising case count reports seem far away. In fact, life may not feel much different than the same time last year. But in urban areas, the protests seem virtually endless, and streets that once held countless commuter cars are now packed with angry mobs. Meanwhile, the case counts in these tightly packed areas are surging, and the few glimpses of normalcy that locals caught in June have quickly disappeared under rolled back reopening plans. For city dwellers, life today looks nothing like it did in 2019. And unfortunately, these conditions will likely only continue to get worse. As for those in less populated spaces, they must be feeling a much greater sense of stability. After all, the skyrocketing unemployment rate nationwide is felt most acutely in urban environments where office workers have been forced to stay home. The country's retail, restaurant, and accommodation hotspots are all located in major cities, and these are the industries that have been hit the hardest by the pandemic, generating the most lost jobs. In the last 18 weeks, over 52 million Americans have filed new claims for unemployment benefits, yet the official unemployment rate in many rural counties has not even hit double digits. While this statistic seems hard to comprehend, especially given that other situations are so much more dire, the data tells a story of deep inequality of the pandemic's effect on rural versus urban communities. In this video, we're going to discuss how the health crisis has taken a disproportionate toll across the United States, hitting urban centers much harder than rural areas. We'll tell you what that means for many of our major cities and how some may never fully recover. We're also going to give you the larger picture of where the country is headed. As rural areas hunker down through the pandemic with relatively few changes to their normal existence, cities have taken an almost apocalyptic turn. New York City was one of the first epicenters of the health crisis, and more recently, the U.S. watched in horror as stores were burning and protests were growing increasingly extreme. As a result of the heightened tension and chaos, New York State's unemployment rate is almost double the national average. These numbers rose to a staggering 20.4% in June, an increase from 18.3% in May and 15% in April. At the same time, the unemployment rate for the U.S. as a whole fell to 11.1% last month, down from April highs of 14.7%. An additional 261,000 people in New York City have suffered job losses since April, bringing the grand total of unemployed individuals to over 811,000, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Reopening measures crept forward last week as media production was allowed to resume. Some cultural institutions like zoos and botanical gardens opened their doors, and professional sports played on, although only to empty stadiums. However, it has already been confirmed that Broadway theaters will remain closed until 2021. Furthermore, indoor dining was prohibited once again, a move that came right as bans were being lifted due to a fear of new cases. Local officials haven't yet announced when gyms, malls, movie theaters, and museums might be safe to accept visitors. Another major city on the opposite coast, Los Angeles, tells the same story. Like New York City, LA's official unemployment rate has been sticking around 20%. According to California's Employment Development Department, the Los Angeles labor market experienced a modest recovery last month, clocking in at a 19.5% unemployment rate, down from May's 20.6%. Still, experts are concerned that it has stalled around 20% despite larger recovery trends nationwide. Of course, matters will only be made worse by the massive wave of new cases that the state is now experiencing. Governor Gavin Newsom recently ordered bars to close their doors again, and indoor activity was suspended for restaurants, wineries, movie theaters, museums, and other businesses. Now, this will only put businesses that have been feeling the strain of earlier lockdowns back into dangerous territory. Many of them won't make it through even further extended restrictions and will fold under the pressure. The metro area of Chicago, the country's third biggest city, also saw its unemployment rate climb from 15.4% in May to 16.1% in June. So, in the country's two most populous cities, 1 in 5 citizens are out of a job. And other major urban centers are not far behind. That does not bode well for the country as a whole. While there's no official definition for an economic depression, experts say that the numbers we're seeing out of cities like LA and New York are certainly a dangerous warning sign. One economist said that prior to this crisis, even an employment rate of 15% would be shocking. In terms of post-World War II experience, 20% is unprecedented. The only other time the word depression has been used was to describe the Great Depression of the late 1920s and 1930s. In more recent economic slumps, like the one in the early 1980s, the unemployment rate reached only 10.8% at its highest. The numbers we are seeing now are double the national highs recorded during the 2007-2009 financial crash, which was termed a mere recession. During the Great Depression, the unemployment rate peaked at around 25% in 1933. It remains yet to be seen if we will reach those levels in the months ahead, but it's far from an impossibility. Many economists have warned that we're heading into new and dangerous territory if we're unable to slow the massive losses hitting all across the country. Making this scenario all the more likely is the fact that the United States has failed to get the health crisis under control, which also means that damaging trends of lowered consumer confidence, minimal foot traffic, and strains for businesses will all persist, further driving the economy into the ground. Moreover, societal tensions continue to rise. Major cities will probably see more of the protests throughout the remainder of the year. Some believe that the November election will spark a significant shift if Joe Biden is able to take office. But the evidence suggests otherwise. Many of the cities that are seeing significant and ongoing demonstrations are run by Democrat leaders, and they have been unsuccessful in tamping down the protests. It seems that regardless of the next party to take to the White House, Democrat or Republican, the issues facing American society will still continue to spark mass movements and will not be silenced just because leadership changes. As for businesses, well, they've been deeply wounded by the loss of profits that come from millions and millions of Americans opting to stay largely at home, even once lockdown measures are lifted. This will only further exacerbate the spike in joblessness. The leisure and hospitality industries have been absolutely devastated, experiencing unemployment rates that skyrocketed from 5.7% in February to nearly 40% in April. The numbers dropped again in June, but hovered around a still catastrophic 28.9%. No other sector comes close to this level of disruption in the workforce. In fact, the restaurant industry was made up of around 9.2 million employees in June, down 25% from February's numbers. Across the country, even those that have managed to hang on to their jobs are looking for a way out. The pandemic has fundamentally changed a profession that was formerly considered stable and geographically flexible, now making it extremely unreliable for the millions that counted on restaurant work for their paycheck This year alone, thousands and thousands of smaller independent restaurants have been forced to shut their doors for good. A recent study by Yelp found that a staggering 60% of restaurants that previously claimed to be temporarily closed on their websites are now listed as permanently closed. These apocalyptic waves of business closures will disrupt major cities for months and possibly even years to come. Some may never return to what they were at the beginning of this year. In entertainment and leisure hotspots, matters are getting desperate. Las Vegas, for example, saw its official unemployment rate hit 29%, which is above Great Depression levels. Even after the health crisis is brought under control, tourism will be slow to come back to pre-pandemic levels. In a worst-case scenario, if the pandemic continues to be a major issue for years, workers would have to leave cities like Las Vegas in droves in order to find work in a more viable setting that doesn't rely on tourism. Unfortunately, this is much easier said than done. In a drastic case like this, the shrinking number of jobs available nationwide would cause fierce competition and the fall of millions of Americans from their comfortable middle-class positions. Already, data suggests that this phenomenon is underway. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, the number of Americans who claim they have little to no chance of being able to pay their rent bills next month is a staggering 24 million. Minority populations are particularly at risk. In June, 28% of black renters said they were unable to pay the prior month's rent. And that number grew to 46% when they were asked about their ability to pay the following month. The strain also hits Hispanic renters, 22% of whom missed last month's rent, 46% of whom said they had little to no confidence they could keep up with next month's bills. As it becomes harder and harder for the average American to keep up with their rent payments, much less other basics like groceries or healthcare, there will also be a spike in social tensions. The public cries for additional assistance from the government will become deafening. Even now, a second stimulus bill is slowly making its way through Congress. While they do provide a cushion for Americans in need, these emergency measures also result in the borrowing and spending of massive sums that further pile onto a rapidly growing U.S. debt. In the long term, these consequences could be catastrophic. Ultimately, the U.S. dollar will keep losing value as debt levels climb ever higher, thanks to further stimulus packages. The economic suffering we are already seeing in cities across the country will continue to intensify, and a coming election won't necessarily change things for the better. Experts have been warning for a while now that this economic downturn will make the last recession of 2007-2009 seem almost laughable, and we're certainly on track for that to be true. For more insights into the economic fallout ahead, check out further work by Michael Snyder, publisher of the Economic Collapse blog, End of the American Dream, and The Most Important News. Snyder's articles can be found on dozens of other prominent websites worldwide. He's the author of 4 books available on Amazon.com, including The Beginning of the End, Get Prepared Now, and Living a Life That Really Matters. In a blog post dated from November 2019, Snyder warned readers about the United States' ticking time bomb and the economic conditions that were shaping up for a major collapse. Now, it is all coming true. Use this window of time wisely and prepare while you still can.